Exactly. Hey, everybody. Sorry about no intro music. Winamp's being a mess today, but happy to have you here as you're listening live at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. GMT on this, the 31st of May, 2020. We are joined today by Ken, of course, but also our special guest, Alexander Romines. Thank you very much for joining us again, sir. It's very nice to have you. And
so yeah, it's great to have you, Kyle. I personally am extremely excited because I know that recently in your email out to everybody, you mentioned that there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on with the new releases this May, both on Kindle and in audio format, on Audible and such. And I actually listened to The City of Thieves in the past 2 weeks. And I thought I would listen to it over 2 weeks. I ended up just plowing through it in like 3 days because I thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah, to the detriment of what the other stuff I should have been doing. I ended up reading too much. So for everybody who doesn't remember you, Kyle, you're maybe do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Kyle Romines. I'm an author from Kentucky. I actually completed medical school at the University of Louisville, and I had my debut novel was published during my third year of medical school. And after medical school, I took a break before getting my license so that I could work on getting as many novels as I could out full time. The Warden of Fall, which is this audiobook series, is fantasy. I also have several horror novels, suspense and thriller, Western, and science fiction as well.
Yeah, so my wife's she wants to be an author, and she's been doing lots of writing recently because when we moved to the US in November, we decided that in order for her to really chase her dreams, she can't really be working full time, and realistically, being wanting to full time also be a writer. So she's now working part time and part time being a writer as well, and. We were discussing actually how it was really fascinating that you are multi-genre. That's something that's always fascinated me about your writing, is that you can shift the sort of perspective, mindset, and the whole perspective of one genre to another. I mean, the very way the narration is spoken, and the very way the phrasing used, and the tone of the book entirely is completely different in different genres. And the fact that you can switch so well between them is almost fascinating to me.
Well, I think actually that my experience writing thrillers has helped me with these fantasy books, because I like the fast-paced, lean storytelling. I might have mentioned this last time I was on the show. I love the fantasy genre, but even some of my favorite books, the authors have a tendency to be very verbose. You have these very long books, and sometimes I can think of one of my favorite books off the top of my head that is an extraordinarily long book, but not much actually happens in it. And I try to stay away from that. My books can be long, medium length for Sword and Sorcery, probably. Each book in the series tends to get progressively longer. But I like plots where a lot of things happen. There are twists and turns. So I took that from writing thrillers and applied it to fantasy.
That's really interesting. And of course, since the last time we spoke, we've had a lot of things happen in the world in general. I mean, we're now suddenly, all locked inside with coronavirus and everything. How has that been affecting you? What have you been up to with everything recently with the coronavirus?
I almost feel bad for saying this, but as someone who I write fiction and I do medical writing as well. Both of those are things that I can do at home. So I've been very fortunate during this time. I've been able to be productive. I've been able to get work done. I've been able to more work done. And my whole family quarantined here. And so it's the longest we've all been together since we were teenagers. And in this dark time in the world, there's still been a lot of good that's come from it in my life. And I'm very grateful for that.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah, I know that I'm also in this article, the privileged step working in research, because all my work's done on a computer, so it makes no difference to me whether it's in an office or at home, and so I'm equally quite privileged. And I think it's a very good thing for us to recognize that, we are able to continue our work, and we are kind of the lucky few, because a lot of people can't right now. Do you find it's actually enhanced your writing ability? Do you feel like you can actually hone your concentration and focus more? Or do you feel like it's more of an inhibitor?
Well, having everyone home has made it more difficult because I want to play with my little nephew, for example. We live on a farm, so I'm able to walk in the woods without fear of running into anyone. We have wide open spaces. Actually, we bought a dairy cow, and chickens to lay eggs to reduce our need to go to the store as much. So that was an experience.
Nice. That has to be quite a new thing to bring on an entirely new, production line, I guess. But different animals to have to learn how to work with, while also, if nothing else, it seems like what a great time to take that on, since it's, you have nothing but time in many cases, or at least with all of your family as well, there being able to focus together on learning how to deal with new animals. That's cool.
That's a good point, and I actually think it helps me with writing as well, because this is a fantasy medieval setting, and some of the short stories I've been writing recently, I've been doing a lot of research into life in small villages during that time, and farming and living off the land. So getting some hands-on experience might bring a little realism to the writing.
That's really cool. Again, it's interesting you have that perspective, because I think we've always said that one of the most difficult things, and probably the only thing that really makes an author, one of the most defining features of a good author, is somebody who can really empathize with another person and put themselves in their shoes enough to be able to narrate them effectively, right? And I think that you've always been quite successful with that in your books, from what I've read anyway. You're very good at being able to empathize with what people like to be in those situations, so that you sell it as a realistic fiction. And I have to say, obviously I have City of Thieves in my mind right now, having just read it. But there's also the narration aspect of it, the fact that obviously I listened to it on Audible, so I had it read to me instead of reading it directly from the page. But I think that the coming together of your writing style, where you can empathize so well with the characters and put yourself in the right place, it's also reflected by the narrator that you've chosen to actually speak those words, because I think he can do the same. And it comes together as a beautiful work of art, where you can really put yourself in the shoes of whoever is being narrated. And that's something I've always respected about your writing and the whole project's put together.
Matt is such a pro. Matt Addis is the narrator of my books. He does Chocolate Fox Productions. He has a whole team that works with him, a sound editor, a copy editor, and I'm so happy that I chose him. He is a pro in every aspect of the word. He's just a genuine nice guy. And he's immensely talented. Even for these books, when I include words, ancient words, he has a Gaelic person that he consults with, actually, I think at a university, to help him make sure that he pronounces the words as best as possible. He actually will Skype me and go over the pronunciation of each of these special words with me. And that's going beyond the call of duty.
No, that's really cool. Because, I wanted to comment because I also just binged and finished listening to it. And he just provides such depth to the characters. The voices he provides, especially for Berenger and everything, just matches my head vision of kind of how I picture it all. So the voices he provides and sounds really draw me in, and makes it just such a well-performed book to listen to. I really do want to give my shout out, because I think his work's amazing.
Oh, absolutely. I think his ability to switch between characters so cleanly and define them. So there's a lot of narrators out there who, when they switch between different characters, you can't necessarily tell who is speaking. And because of the way that, writing is, you don't always say said, character name at the end of every sentence, especially if it's in a discussion of several people. But his narration makes it really easy, even if you drop out for a second and come back, or you lose attention and then you come back, you can always tell exactly who's speaking. That's very important. Also, this is a bit silly, but the one thing I really love about his narration is when he describes food. It always makes me so hungry.
Yes.
The way like when he talks about like the various, I can't remember the name of the type of gravy that you sort of gruelish sort of gravy that exists in some of the villages that's sort of like the poor man's meal. When he describes that, and Warden Berenger is eating this, even though it's a simple meal and it's clearly meant to be, not the most delicious kingly food of all time, it just sounds so delicious because you can tell that Berenger's hungry, and the way he describes it as being very fulfilling, and it just makes my mouth water every time I hear it. I don't know why. He's just very good at narrating that.
Berenger's always hungry.
Yes, he is. And this is one of the notes that I had from City of Thieves. Is one of the things I found really fascinating about this book is the traditional fantasy classes, as it were, like rogue or hunter or warrior. They're really blended together with these sort of like racial attributes as well. So the lines are all kind of blurry and phased from traditional fantasy. I feel like you defined your own understanding of what each character can do. They're not restricted to a single set of skills.
Yes, and I love writing the different classes or the different races in the books and then describing the relationships between them that exist in their society and contrasting it between the different kingdoms. So Morwen, for example, the Berenger's magician companion, she comes from a place where magic and non-humans are more tolerated. We meet a goblin in book 2, actually, who is working at his forge. He's a blacksmith in the city. Well, that never would have happened in Leinster. So it's fun to write the different, how they're even in this land, that the differences in the attitudes towards magic and non-humans, even between the kingdoms themselves. In the 4th book, we'll get to the north where Berenger's from, and we'll introduce giants. And if there's an implication, I never state this explicitly, but there's an implication that Berenger has giant's blood, and because he's such a large character, things that might kill, things that might kill someone. He's been shot more times than he should. He's a larger character. He has greater endurance, and there are giants in the north, and giant reproduction is difficult because just like in elephants, you see that they have it takes longer gestational times because of how large they are. So there's a high giant maternal, there's a low birth rate and high incidence of maternal and fetal demise. So you see often giant women that look for human men to procreate with. Whereas the reverse can't be true, because if a giant male procreated with a human female, it would kill her. And so because of that, you have the people, the men and women in the north are larger. They're seen as more barbarians because they have a more warlike culture. There also are more fairies in the north as well, and they're descendants of the elder gods in the north. So you have some people who have golden eyes in the north as well, and they're believed to be descendants of the elder gods. So it's fun. It's fun to write these. It's just very fun to create a fantasy world and then introduce aspects of our own world that are real and that you can relate to, but use a fantasy backdrop to explain it in a different way, a different context.
Absolutely. I've also, going back to the race thing, elves are sort of introduced properly, and fairies are properly introduced in City of Thieves, and I think that's really fascinating, because before in book 1 it felt very violent sort of fantasy, and it was while it was still violent in book 2. Don't get me wrong. It did take this tone of there being these elegant races that also exist, that live these very long lives and are more tricksters rather than necessarily directly violent. And it was really interesting to see this again, this mixing of different types of fantasy coming together, traditional fantasy, these sort of precepts of races that exist coming together into this new form, which I really enjoyed. I also like the different kinds of magic that can be expressed by these different races. How do you go about defining your magic system? Because I've done a little bit of reading myself on soft magic systems and hard magic systems and that kind of thing. What made you design your magic system to be tied in with races, and how did you make sure that the magic systems weren't, for example, too powerful or too vague and so on?
Sure. So first of all, I want to say that magic is magic in my book. So it's not Marvel Universe. It's not magic is science that hasn't been explained yet. But there is a science aspect to it. There are different disciplines. I guess the analogy that I would make is you had a physicist on the show last week, I believe, and
Yes.
in the way that maybe classical mechanics might be different from quantum physics, they're still the same. It's still physics. It's still and I might be wrong about this, so correct me if I'm stating it incorrectly, but they're different branches of the same field. And so magic in my books is very similar. It is people try to understand it. There are magicians, there are mages, and it's this great mystery. I have in one of my short stories, Ravana, who's a dark sorceress, is being trained by her master, Azeroth, and he explains to her that magic is as much of an art as it is a science. And so you have these you do have these extraordinarily powerful beings that are the elder gods or godlike figures. They're not true gods. And then below them you have sorcerers. And sorcerers, think of an athlete. So think of maybe a magician would be a high school basketball player. And
Okay.
and a sorcerer would be LeBron James, someone who is naturally gifted and it just comes naturally to them. And then they also start out with they are more physically powerful. So to carry the analogy over, a sorcerer has immense stores of magic. But beyond that, magic just comes naturally to them. Spells that might give a magician a hard time, years to learn and practice. I mean, have you ever met people in your life that it just seems like they're so gifted, prodigies, that things just come naturally to them that take
Hmm.
you a hard time to crack? And so that's how sorcerers are compared to magicians and mages in my books. But I really enjoy creating and shaping magic. I like to explain it a little, to pull back the curtain a little, but then also still say that there is a great mystery to this that we'll never understand. I enjoy one of the things we talked about last time that I enjoyed doing in my book is comparing the perception of something within the world. So, for example, Berenger is painted as this villain where he really does things that are more heroic. So, the difference in what people believe and what the stories say versus what truth is. And if you look in this book, many of the characters talk about how magic is declining. How
Hmm.
and yet if you're reading the book, you say, well, magic is everywhere. You say, look at something like Game of Thrones, where Melisandre's magic is she burns these leeches and says, I'm going to kill these kings, and the kings die, and you wonder, is it really that her magic did it, or were they going to die anyway? Like, how strong is the connection between cause and effect? So it's vaguer. Well, in my books, there is stronger magic, and yet the characters say they think that, oh, because there are fewer non-humans or there aren't as many fairies as there used to be, they perceive that there's not as much magic. So I really do like to play with that.
Yeah, that was really interesting the way you described the comparison with Game of Thrones magic as well. I hadn't really thought about the cause and effect of magic like that, and that's a really fascinating way to think of it. I guess that's the kind of perspective you get as an author, that when you see other fantasy writings that are out there, you sort of delve deeper in some ways. I know that in high school I did a lot of and I've played guitar for about 20 years. Um, and I know that with my sort of musical training that I had during high school and everything, when I started listening to music after doing that, I know that I started no longer just listening, but also, sort of dissect the pieces and pull out some additional information that you can tell what kind of era it's from and things like that. I imagine you do similar now with when you either watch or read other fantasy. You must sort of dig into the design behind it and actually consider it and compare it to others.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. Um, so I also want to mention that another praise for you, I'm afraid. Uh, in book two, City of Thieves, I was really impressed because in the first book, I thought one of the strengths was the interlacing storyline, how everything sort of came together towards the end, and that was really quite impressive. You had these different quest lines almost that all come together, and I thought that was really impressive. And then, even though that was impressive, it did not prepare me for book two, where that is done, times 10. Uh, the fact that there was just so many different historical elements, artifacts of the land, relationships between royalty and thieves, and the Warden Berenger himself, all sort of came together throughout the story. I was just repeatedly impressed, and every time in the last, quarter of the book, something was revealed. I was like, "Wow, that's crazy! It must have all been coming to this." And then, 2 pages later, there's another huge reveal, and I was really shocked. And I have to say, even though you very kindly provided us with the codes to the audiobooks, I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads largely because of the intertwining story and the fact that to me, audiobooks are something that I can, listen to while doing something else. I'll be doing dishes, or I'll be going for walking the dogs or something. I kept having to stop what I was doing to listen to the story whenever there was another big reveal, because it took my whole attention, and my wife kept saying, why are you laughing, or why do you look so astonished? And it was usually because there was some big reveal that I hadn't seen coming, and that was so how much design goes into these stories beforehand? Do you sort of write? Do you just write what's in your mind, and these intertwining storylines come together as you write, or is it more like you sit and design and plan the chapters beforehand and then flesh them out?
So in the writing world, there are the pantsers and there are the plotters. The plotters are the people who have a 50-page outline before they ever start. They know what's going to happen chapter by chapter. And then you have the pantsers that are George R. R. Martin, for example. And the pantsers kind of have an idea where they want the story to go, but then they allow characters to change and to inform where the story goes from there. And sometimes that can introduce problems. So in Martin's case, he's introduced so many new characters into his books that they continue to grow and grow and grow. And he may even have trouble ending the story because because the characters can get away from him. And I actually fall into his camp as well. I do have a general plan. I know where I want the series to go, and I know where I want each book to go. And I know largely what I want the characters to do for their arcs, but they also surprise me. Tristan was supposed to die in this story, and he actually the story, the sacrifice was going to be successful at the end of the book. The creature was freed. There was a great assault on the city, a great defense that was mounted, a huge battle scene. And the story took Berenger. They took it in a completely different direction that I wasn't expecting. I definitely fall into that category as well.
I think that comes with the empathy that we were sort of discussing earlier. The fact that you can put yourself into the character's shoes. You said the way you phrased that was that the Berenger chose the decision almost. And I think that really shows that you are able to put yourself into the shoes of your characters to experience that world, and you felt out what would be the most appropriate storyline and the most likely for that circumstance that you initially set up.
Well, Berenger needed a win in this book, I felt. So the first book is very dark, very bleak. There's even a line that it was as if nothing he did made any difference. Then the second book, he makes a positive difference, but it's very bittersweet. If you look at what happens with Ravenna, the king dies, the queen dies. It's a mixed bag. And so in this book, City of Thieves, it is, I would say, the most hopeful book in the series. It's the most traditional fantasy book in the series. There's a quest element to it. And I wanted that for a reason. Basically, I'm tricking the reader, making them happy before I plunge right back into the darkness in book 4. No, I really wanted Berenger to have a win in this book, for it to be the most optimistic, because I think that's true in real life. So I don't think being realistic in fantasy means that everything has to go wrong for the characters all the time. So you see some fantasy where it's so dark that you wonder, when are the characters ever going to win? And then you have some fantasy where none of the main characters are harmed. Everything works out in their favor. They survive situations that they never should. And so I wanted to bring more of a realistic sometimes we have good days and sometimes we have bad days. And so Berenger, who's someone who can be very cynical, who does have many bad things happen to him, even someone like him, sometimes we just have good days where things go right for us. And I wanted to incorporate an element of that into this book where, especially he has so much suspicion of Lucian based on what happened with Imogen in Wrath of Lords. I wanted to kind of have things turn out right and surprise him. And hopefully, hopefully that was conveyed.
Oh, it absolutely was. So dare I ask the question of the next book in the series? When will that narration be available?
Sure. So my goal is to have it maybe by November or December, by the end of the year. I have some things I need to fix with the fourth book before I get it to Matt. There's one character that I have in the fourth book that I need to change some dialogue. We talked about this last time about how I can update things in the books, and it's because books 5 and 6, I've cracked the story, I'm ready to write them, but I can't get over that hump until I fix that line of dialogue. Mm-hmm. But the fifth, I'm very excited for the fourth book. The fourth book is called The Will of Queens, and the world building in these books can be divided into maybe 5 main categories. So you have the Shadow Wars and Azeroth and the High Queen rise to power. That each book we give a little more information about that. We have Berenger's past, which is fleshed out a little in each book. We have what's going on with the fairies that was introduced in this book and will continue. We have the Fomorian conspiracy that was introduced in the Wrath of Lords and then brought back. One of my favorite things to do in this book was to bring some, even though every book is meant to stand alone until the end, I brought back some characters like Friar Godfrey or some ideas like Baelor and the Fomorians. I was able to bring them back. And so with each book, I'm going to do that. With the fourth book, there's a fan favorite character from book 2 who I'll be bringing back, who shows up in a big way, who comes back. Cool. And another character from book 1 who comes back. So I enjoy kind of shuffling the elements of these stories. But the element in book 4 that really gets addressed is Berenger's past. So we've had more and more of Berenger's past fleshed out with each book. But he's coming home in the fourth book. That is, he's been away from home for 25 years. He left and never looked back. And now circumstances are conspiring to drive him back. Only this time he has Morwen with him. And it's just a very dark book because I don't know. I'll give you my experience as someone who was raised in a small town and moved to the city. When I come home, it's as if my friends in the city know me in a certain way. But when I come home, and I've changed, I'm not the same person that I was. Mm-hmm. And yet when I return to the place where everyone knew me, it's as if somehow I once again take on that role, even though I've grown so much as a person. And so it's interesting. Berenger has grown over the course of these books. He's slowly, but he's changed. But the question is, when he's tested, when he's brought back into the land where he was an outlaw, where he did these terrible things, how much has he really grown? And how much has he really grown? And if he's forced to confront his past, will that inspire the best in him, or will that bring out the worst in him again? And I don't want to give away the game, but I will say that something I enjoy as a writer, writing character arcs. Characters don't just grow from point A to point B. Berenger starts out as a broken man, and then he becomes happy and just becomes this moral man. Even if that's his trajectory, in real life, no one goes from A to B. No. The fact is we backslide sometimes. So sometimes we make progress, and then we throw it all away and go back to square one. Or even we go back a few steps farther than that. So it's interesting to play with his character development and the other characters as well. But I think readers will really, I want to make sure that book 4 is as perfect as it can be before I get it out in audio, because it's something that I found. I wrote book 4 before Matt started doing the audiobooks. And I've learned hearing him narrate that it's different spoken. It's a different experience when it's spoken versus when it's written. So for example, if you have in a book, if you said, I'm going to hunt some goblins, quote, Berenger said, well, you don't think anything about it. But if I'm narrating it and it's Berenger said, Morwen said, Berenger said, then that said, it really sticks in your ear, and so I have some things like that I need to fix I've learned to write to audio. I want to keep my listeners in mind when I write the books, even though my Kindle, because it actually makes the Kindle and paperback versions better as well.
That's true, and that's really fascinating that you say that, because in some ways, yeah, I think if you use the words, same with any writing, if you use the word "said" too many times, it does become a bit bland, right? But what I really enjoy reading or listening to your books is when you say something like, I don't know, he said tersely, right? And I like then comparing how Mr. Addis does the narration of speaking tersely as Berenger, and it's just interesting to try and compare the two. You know, both his portrayal of the character and saying something tersely versus what was written and is supposed to be terse. I suppose it's when there's ambiguity with, for example, saying "said," right? Especially with something like "I'm going to go hunt goblins." That could be said cheerily, with fervor. That could be said sadly. It depends on the mood of the character and how Matt decides it should be said. So I can absolutely see how that would really modify my own writing if I was in your shoes. I know. So are there any other ways that you found Matt's narrating has affected your writing at all?
It makes me want to write more varieties of creature. I loved, for example, what he did with the changeling's voice in this book.
I like that too.
I am very interested to see what he does with the trolls and the giants in book 4.
Yeah, that will be interesting. Because I think the mixes of age, gender, race, and I suppose mood or disposition of the person makes it quite difficult to have unique characters. I imagine it must be quite difficult for him to actually remember all the voices for everybody. So tell us more about these Skype interviews not interviews, these Skype chats that you have with Matt, and how you guys define a character. Does he okay it with you first, or is it more of a you just hear how he presents things and he asks questions? How does that go around?
For the very first book, we had more of that discussion where I had given him some notes. So when you produce an audiobook, you put it up for audition, and different narrators can say, oh, this is my take on the character. I would love to work with you on producing this. But I knew right away, and this is something we're going to talk about later today, but I had a friend actually, and we're going to talk about one of the projects I'm working on. Well, it's dedicated to my friend's memory. My friend was a huge audiobook reader. He actually wanted to narrate books himself. He had taken a class, a voice acting class at Louisville, and he was just hugely passionate. So I had narrowed down my audio choices, and he helped me choose Matt. And he was one of the biggest champions. He unfortunately, he passed away of a heart attack earlier this year, back in February, at the age of 32. Right after.
Condolences. That's very sad.
Yes, so I've dedicated my next book actually to his memory. His name was Joe, and he was a huge fan of fantasy. Joe Mills. He loved Dungeons and Dragons. He loved to cosplay. He was a staple at my board game night. We were able to hang out and play board games the night before he passed away. And he's just a great guy. So you have him to thank for me choosing Matt, actually. He championed Matt the whole way. Not that I needed much convincing, but he said, this is who you need to go with. And I've been so happy with Matt. To answer your question, that first time I gave Matt a little more direction, but after that, I knew what a pro he was, and I have stepped back largely. There are times when I'll say, well, I always send a list of characters with their age, gender, race, and or species, and also where they're from. So I have some characters that are Danes in some of the books. I have some characters that are from Albion or Britain in some of the books, or Caledonia, Scotland in some of the books. So but I pass along that information and just a brief description of the character and their arc in the story. But now I largely sit back and let Matt do his thing and don't get in his way, because he and his team read the whole book and they discuss it, and he's done some things that surprised me, some things that I enjoy how he makes the hobgoblins and the goblins sound like cousins. So the goblins have a more amphibious sound in Wrath of Lords, and then the goblins have a more reptilian sound in City of Thieves. And that I didn't tell him to do that. He did that. So we have a wonderful collaborative process, but also he has never asked me to do this, but I like to step back and let him see what he can do. And I think I've never talked with him about this, but hopefully he enjoys that he has that freedom. There are some authors, I'm sure, that have even more. They like to exercise more control. But because I know that he's a creative and that he's an actor, I think I don't know. If it was me, I think it would be nice to have that freedom to play with. And I think he takes it and he runs with it.
Absolutely. I mean, so long as he's reading the lines that you've written, he is expressing the part that you have, well, the creation of the world and so on. But you're right that is how he adds his creative flair to his part in the creative process. Does he ever do any live readings or anything? That would be a fascinating idea during the pandemic and isolation. A live reading of some of your work or anything like that. That would be quite fascinating.
I have a couple videos that he has done of his performance in the studio.
You mentioned this last time, yeah.
Before the pandemic hit, he was talking about doing a collaborative interview with him, and I would have joined in and his Gaelic speaker, but the pandemic kind of ruined that. But yeah, no, if you guys are ever interested in talking to an audio narrator, have you spoken with an audio narrator on your show before?
No, we haven't. No.
It might be worth reaching out to him. I don't. He's always been very friendly and receptive to my inquiries. But yeah, no, he's such a pleasure to work with, and he just seems like such a genuine, great guy.
Well, yeah, I think we would love to have him on, and maybe if he speaks for 2 minutes as Warden Berenger, he can probably satisfy my I don't know. Fan love of all of his narrating. That'd be really enjoyable. Yeah, well, I think we'll shoot him an email and ask him. But yeah, that's really interesting that you guys have such a good relationship, good working relationship, and you're producing something together that is both a unique form of work in the fact that it's a narrated version of an original and completely separate work as well. That's fascinating how that works. So the next thing I had mentioned was written down here was about fan art. So how much fan art have you noticed coming out of your not just the Warden of Fall series, but of all your books? Have you noticed much in the way of fan art?
You know, it's surprising. The book that I get the most fan art for is actually my debut novel, The Keeper of the Crows. People like to draw scarecrows, and they like to draw that book, spoiler alert, is about it's a mystery in a small town in rural Kentucky where scarecrows are popping up at murder scenes. And supernatural mystery. So the scarecrows are coming to life, and people really love that, and they send me art of. If I'd known in advance you were going to ask the question, I would have had some of the art for you to see. But it's fun to see their different takes. Some people draw the pumpkin head on the scarecrow, or the very slender scarecrow with long spindly fingers, and others draw the more straw man. But people send me scarecrows all the time, and it's awesome. It's fun.
That's really cool. No, I did a quick look for just your name and the phrase fan art, and I did find some around the place, and it's quite fascinating to see. I imagine most of them don't have your name attached. Most of them will probably have the names of the different books and everything, but just a quick glance, it's quite fascinating to see. How does it make you feel seeing that? Does it like inspire you? Does it make you feel, I don't know, disappointed if they get, like, I don't know, some details wrong or something, or it's not how you envisaged?
Oh no, I'm always so happy to see it, because it means that your story meant something. For somebody to actually take the time and create something based on your work, it means it spoke to something in them. Anytime someone spends any time reflecting on something I made, it just brings me so much happiness. It's such a rewarding feeling. And I remember even I was speaking to a middle school group that had read one of my books, and one of the girls hands me a picture of a scarecrow, and it has a nice stitched smiley face. So unlike the creepy and evil scarecrows in my books, it was just a kindly looking scarecrow. And I thought, well, how wonderful! Thank you so much.
That's sweet. I really like that. And one of the questions I had as well, Brendan, was so when you're considering new races and like I said before, breaking from the mold of traditional fantasy, and you want to do your own stint on elves or your own outlook on goblins. What makes you decide? How are you inspired to make the races different and stand out?
Sure. Well, one of the things I like to do is to play into tropes and then surprise you. So to make you think, oh, and to show you that there's something more than what you think. So I try to make Berenger, for example, if you start reading the very first book, you think, okay, this guy's going to be the stereotypical warrior type. There's nothing more to him. And I do that with every character from all the different species. I enjoy making, and it helps make them unique as well. So Azora, the fairy character, she's one of my favorite characters, actually. And she has a personal connection to one of the major characters in the series that we haven't met yet. But she's so fun because she has a lot of pride in being a fairy, but she also loves humans as well. She has this deep. I'm about to write an Azora short story, a fantasy heist, which is I'm very much looking forward to. And she is so playful, and but there are fairies that are more malevolent, that still have that mischievousness, but it's far darker. And the goblins, how Tila and Lucian, or Tila's view of Berenger, and how people can, and it's because in real life people can surprise you. And I want to do that with my characters. I want you to think one thing and then you say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize this about them, or they are capable of more than I realized. Even some of my antagonists and villains in the series have more depth to them. So one of my short stories, The Secrets of Sorcerers, is about Ravena, who is a dark sorceress. She is, spoiler alert, the antagonist in book 2. And it's about her being trained by her master. And traditionally, if you think of fantasy or media, you have the big boss villain who always looks down on Voldemort, for example, who looks down on his henchmen who are always incompetent, and it just blames them and kills them anytime they let him down or tortures them. And I wanted to do something different. I wanted to write two antagonists, two villains, who have this deep, abiding respect and admiration and even love for each other in ways. And they're both two very broken, flawed, dark people, and yet Ravenna is no henchman. She's an equal partner. She's a very competent, so she's not some incompetent henchman. And they just both, when they make mistakes or when they fail, they're both there for each other in the same ways that the heroes can be, in the same ways that Berenger and Morwen can grow together as friends. I wanted to show two antagonists that are friends too, because even the people in our world that are more villainous are not. Many people are not completely one thing or the other, and so just because you might be a quote unquote bad guy doesn't mean you can't have friends. And so I always try to do that, to flesh out all the main characters and the side characters as much as I can.
I think there's a difference between making a sort of overly simplified story. Like, I think if you're making a short story or something, it makes sense to have a bad guy who isn't really well defined as anything else, because you don't have the time to flesh them out and make them have that sort of gray morality. But I think that's one of the things that makes your book so enjoyable to read, is that the characters do have the good guys have flaws, including Warwick Berger especially. He's a man of walking flaws and traumatic history. And it's the same with the enemies as well, that they seem to also have an agenda that isn't just I'm bad. They tend to have a legitimate and fairly understandable, frequently, point of view. And it's always enjoyable when you're reading a book where you think, is the main character actually being the good guy here? And sometimes you think definitely not in this situation, and that's always very much appreciated.
We talked about the perception of truth in my books, and even Berenger, he's perceived as the bad guy by so many people in the context of the story. In book 4, we meet the oldest warden, Warden Callahan, and he's a great monster hunter. That was before he was a warden; he was a monster hunter. That was his profession. And just like the zealots we meet in this book, the acolytes, he believed that that was his noble calling, that non-humans are scum and deserve to be wiped out. So he, in some ways, he's a much worse human being than Berenger. His own son committed suicide because this is a spoiler alert, but Warden Callahan, he trained his children to be monster hunters like him. And Callahan's son actually cared about these monsters, these non-humans, and he tried to resolve conflicts peacefully. He stopped wanting to kill them like his father wanted. And I won't get into any more spoilers here. It's just an aside, but I just wanted to use that as an example to say, in the context of the story, the people love Warden Callahan. They see him as this monster hunter who keeps their villages safe from trolls and the like, and yet he is more brutal even than Berenger. And so it's fun to play with that. Some people who are perceived as heroes may not be, and people who are perceived as villains may not be.
Another really fascinating character in the series that you mentioned previously is Friar Godfrey. And I know that Friar Godfrey, at least where I am so far in the series, 3 out of 4, Friar Godfrey's past is very hidden away. You know that there is one. You know that he's clearly got some interesting history where he hasn't always been a godly man. And I look forward to that being expanded upon. And to be fair, I may be asking here in ignorance because it may already be published in book 4. But in terms of religion, how does that... how does religion affect this universe? Do you feel like it's an active force that is real and will genuinely, affect the characters and how actively shape storylines? Or do you think it's more of like a passive force or possibly non-existent and just something that's a belief system and nothing else?
Oh gosh, so I can't answer that without major spoilers for the very end of the series. I probably should take a pass on that. I will say that I do work hard on having different religions in the books. So the Danes have their own religion that's kind of like Norse mythology. There is the Lord of Hosts represents the Christian God. The Lord of Hosts and the good teacher is kind of like the Christian God and Jesus, the analogy in these books. And then, of course, you have the elder gods, which you haven't seen much of because Padrig spread the word of the Lord of Hosts centuries ago, and so now that's the dominant religion. But in the north, where we're headed in book 4, worship of the elder gods still predominates. And so I will spoil that the elder gods are real. Does that mean, though, that they are true gods in the sense of they created the world, or are they just very, very, very powerful beings? And that's something that I won't answer here, or even say if I answer it in the course of the series. But it is something I've always found the religious aspects to be interesting in fantasy, in the same way that you and I were talking about race elements and species elements, because they reflect aspects of our own world, but are different enough to where it's not distracting and it doesn't come across as, oh, Kyle is sharing what you should think about X or what you should believe about Y. Instead, it's more they're just there, in the same ways that in our world some things are just there, and then you navigate through life and decide what you think about it for yourself.
No, that's very well said, and I think you're also putting yourself in the not just the boots of your characters, but also in the shoes of your readers as well. There, you don't want to be saying this is the way it should be, but you're trying to present a world as is, and that's very interesting. Can I also ask then? Okay, that you may feel free to say no to this because I guess it's kind of the same question but rephrased in a sense. Do you visit any sort of like priestly powers or sort of like Templar, Paladin type powers or anything in the series, or do you plan to?
Yeah, so you see in the first book there's a shade that Godfrey repels,
Yes.
and you will see more of that with my take on vampires in book 4. Um, and yes, so you will definitely see that more of that holy element. But even that is not clearly defined in the same way that magic is not clearly defined. I like to give detail and hint at things, but then also leave it ambiguous enough to keep the grand mystery about it, in the same way that there's so much mystery in our lives. I think once you reveal everything about something, once you rob it of its mystery, you rob it of that mystique. And I would never want to do that.
Oh, no, absolutely. I'm actually reading a series just now called the Lightbringer series. I'm only a couple books in so far, but it's very much a hard magic system where everything's explicitly defined, and it's got some really crazy, complex rule systems that are sort of layered over each other, and it's kind of difficult to parse through it. I think that if you do want to have a truly hard magic system where everything is defined, it needs to be thoroughly complex to be interesting, which makes it in a way not very fun because then you have to memorize it all, right? And no, I really enjoy how magic's done in your books so far. I really like the twists of traditional magic just being within you or bloodline, and the fact that there's these objects of powers like runes, which I find really fascinating. And so, again, so far from what I've read, it's not been very well defined, other than the fact that you really need to be both either well trained and or have other artifacts to help you channel the power within runes. Otherwise, you're going to either not do as you intended, or possibly harm yourself by burning your hand, for example, as you use them. And that's been really interesting. So, are the runes very much inspired? I take it from sort of Norse mythology. Is that where that sort of comes from?
I really don't know where the runes, how they first popped into my head. There's some things that just boom. I'll be walking, listening to music, and then I'll say, "Huh, that would be cool." But if you don't mind, I wanted to go back to something you said about the bloodlines.
Please,
Um,
yeah.
the bloodlines don't play as big of a role in the book as book 2 would make you think. So the biggest sorcerer in Fal's history, the greatest hero, Thane Ramsay, he came from nothing. He came from this village. He was not some chosen one. He had no royal birth, no magic in his past. He was no half fairy or anything like that. He was just an average person who had immense power that came from nothing. And then you have King Moore, who had a great magician in his background, and yet centuries went by and no one in their family manifested magical gifts. So it's not in the same way that it's genetic traits, it's some recessive allele that it's just going to keep showing up, and you have these you don't have these families that can just keep using magic. And actually, that's part of Moore's story, is that he was so determined to make sure that he had a magician for the realm that it led to his downfall in many ways, with his when he conceived Morwen, and then the way he didn't realize that his own daughter Ravena actually was capable of magic. So it's
That's
less.
a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah.
So yeah, and some of the short stories I've written, because Ravena is actually one of my favorite characters, and she'll show up again in the main series. But I've written 2 short stories with her now where she's the protagonist, and yeah, her feelings toward her father and her feelings toward Morwen are very complicated, and she's a lot of fun to write.
So, your short stories, we have a couple things that you've very kindly let us both announce on the show, and you actually sent us some interesting media to show here as well. But I think we'll just save that for just after the musical break, which we'll take in a moment. That way we can, keep everybody interested and coming back after the hour. So we're going to take a short break just now. We'll be about 5 to 10 minutes. During that time, please feel free to grab yourself a drink, take part in the chat. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat as well for Kyle, be the in terms of to do with the series, the Warden of Fall itself, or other books written by Kyle, or for Kyle as a general author as well. Ask any questions that you're interested in passing on. We'd be very, very interested in passing those questions on. So with that, you are listening to ShowX on twitch.tv/ReasonablyShowX. We'll be back in 5 to 10 minutes.
And hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Ken, I'm going to let you pick back things up so that my throat doesn't die on me as I sit here and listen happily to the wonderful conversation you guys are having.
Yeah, thank you very much for posting and still being here today, Wayne, with your sore throat. Very much appreciate it. So we're back with Kyle Alexander Romines. Thank you very much for joining us again, sir. Especially for the whole 2 hours. You're very easy to chat to, so it's really enjoyable to have you here today. So my wife actually, I mentioned during the break that you were on, and she was like, "Oh, that's today," and then she sent me like 6 questions herself of things to ask you. So we'll get to those eventually, but we have some new content that you sent in to the show for a first time reveal, which was very kind. So included is, first of all, let's maybe go over the art for the Tales of Fall, the anthology you're releasing later this summer. This hasn't been publicly shown yet, right? This is the first time?
That's right. So I have not announced this anywhere. You're among the very first to see the cover art for my next book, which is it's an anthology of all the short stories that I've written about Warden Berenger and his world. So it follows some of the key characters, some of the key events that are mentioned in Warden of Fall, and it fleshes them out in greater detail.
Okay.
And it's a huge anthology. So I say short stories, but some of these stories are 75 or 100 pages. So this is going to be the longest book I've ever written. It's over 500 pages.
That's so cool. I didn't realize that it was going to be so big. I thought this was just like a couple of short stories, like 100 pages max. That's really exciting. Wow. So what made you decide to do an anthology?
Well, as I was preparing to write the 5th and 6th books and breaking down the story, there were some events in the past books that I really wanted to flesh out in greater detail. There are things I've mentioned. I'll give you an example. The riots in Denorlan that are mentioned in this book, what Berenger did. One of those stories is in this anthology. It's called The Way of Rage, and it tells the story about what actually happened when Berenger showed up. And so you don't have to have read that story to understand everything in City of Thieves, but if you do, it gives you a more complete picture of the things Berenger did and saw and what that was like for him. I can be more experimental with these stories. Some of the stories are written in first person from Berenger's point of view, or from some characters that you have not yet met in the series, such as Nora, the High Queen. Her first meeting with Berenger is detailed in The Path of Vengeance. So there are the stories, and it takes place before, during, and even after the Warden of Fall series. So there are all kinds of stories that will enhance it. I call it a companion series to the Warden of Fall. It's not necessary to read these stories to understand everything in Warden, but if you do read them, there are some real fun. Secrets of Sorcerers is one of my favorites. It is about a desperate Ravena having escaped her husband's castle, and she turns to a dark sorcerer to learn magic. And there are all the stories like that. I really think readers who enjoy Warden of Fall are going to love these stories.
That's so exciting. And actually, one of the questions I had written down was, when will we actually get to meet Nora? And I was going to ask if it might be in the next book that I just hadn't read yet. But that's really exciting that we get to actually see what forged the Warden himself, right? What actually forged him into the character that he is today, and why he has such respect for Nora as well, the High Queen. So
Nora will be in book 5. That's when she will appear in the context of the series for the first time, and she will be one of the most important characters. There's a reason I've held her back and have not yet introduced her. I wanted to start small with these books. The first book is not in some grand kingdom. It is in a small village for the most of the story. And then we build up. Book 2 is in the capital, is Munster's capital, and book 3. And so you see the story getting broader and expanding and bringing back old characters and introducing new characters, which we do in this book and we do again in book 4, and introducing a new kingdom, so that by the end of it, you were talking about how this is the more traditional fantasy in book 3. Book 1 is the dark fantasy. Book 2 is the mystery fantasy. Well, we are building toward the epic fantasy.
That's really exciting. Oh my God. So we've got the artwork here. Wayne, if you would very kindly show the audience, let's have our first look at this.
Here we go. So switching over so you can all see the title for Tales of Fall.
Thank you very much. So there's two pieces of imagery that we have here for the Tales of Fall. One is the actual book itself, including the title and the author tag at the bottom, which is in sort of portrait mode, which it has to be, of course, for being a book. And then the second one that we have is the full-fledged wallpaper-esque sort of painting, I suppose, digital painting, I think. It's beautiful, and it's really interesting to see there's a dragon involved. That makes it really traditional fantasy right there, right? It has to be a dragon involved. So Kyle, tell us about this.
Sure. Well, the dragon is in one of the stories, so if you are looking forward to, and I won't say 100% it's a dragon, but there's more to it. There's more to it, but that's the Heart of Magic with Morwen. That's her story. Most of the main characters in the books get their own short story or novella. Berenger, Ravana, Nora, Azeroth. Who else? Azura will have one, and then I throw in Callahan as well.
That's really cool. The chat's saying, "Oh my God, that's stunning! Wow, just actual wow!" It is actually a beautiful painting with really nice light work as well. So who's the artist?
So the artist for all 6 of my Warden of Fall books his name is Jeff Brown. I like to tell people I have an international team. I mentioned this on the show last time. Matt Addis is from Great Britain. My editor, Katie King, is from Canada. My proofreader is from here in the United States. But Jeff actually lives in Mexico. And then my character illustrator, Matt Forsyth, is from New Zealand. But Jeff is an incredible, go to jeffbrowngraphics.com if you're watching and you want to look at some of his other covers or art. He's amazing. And I've been more and more impressed with each book. This one is probably my favorite so far, but I'm really looking forward to what he does for the 6th and final cover. The title of that book is The Lord of Shadows, and every book has a different color. So the first one's green, the second one is red or yellow, and then the last one, or the City of Thieves, is orangish because it's fall, and Will of Queens is blue, winter. But the last one will be black, and I want it to be a big siege because it's this epic battle, this epic finale to the story.
So how accurate would you say this is to how you envisaged the land and the actual structure of the city? Do you think is this exactly what, did you detail, for example, there must be a house here and a house here because that's how it's described in the story, or did you give a sort of vague idea and then how did you go about doing it?
Well, I have a similar process with Jeff, actually. I tell you, the person who has to deal with the most interference from me is probably my character illustrator, Matt Forsyth, because I do have in my head exactly how I want the characters to look. So he has a little less freedom. But Jeff and Matt, I tell Jeff, I say, I've seen your other fantasy landscapes. This is the main idea of what I want. You take it and you run with it. And I've never been disappointed.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for sharing the release with us today. That's really exciting. So what kind of dates are we looking at for the Tales of Fall?
I handed it off to the proofreader 2 days ago. So she said to expect it back in 2 weeks. So my goal is to publish it in the middle of June. I'm going to publish it in paperback first to get some reviews, and then I'll publish the Kindle edition and get those linked up and promote the Kindle version after I have 5 or so reviews, because that makes my promotions and my advertising. Once you have that social proof, those reviews, the books just always sell exponentially more when I kick my advertising on.
Of course. Yep. Okay. Let us know when it's all released, because we will be more than happy to share links out and everything. We've already put your Amazon page out in the chat there. So everybody be sure to click on that link. You can actually follow and get them and be part of your mailing list as well, right?
That's right.
I know that's how I've been receiving and getting updates. You can hit follow on Kyle's page on Amazon there, and you can follow directly on Amazon, and you can also sign up to the email list. So thank you so much for letting us show that. That's really exciting. The other thing you've sent in, which fits in there very much with what we were saying earlier about the narration by Mr. Addis. We've actually got a 5-minute sample here, so I think we should listen to the whole thing, if that's okay with everybody, and then we can discuss whatever comes up from listening to it and what we think of that.
All right, so with that, let me cue up the actual audio here.
Sorry, Wayne, I should have given you more forewarning.
No, you're good. You're good. I got it, and it's coming through. So everybody get ready. This is a sample from City of Thebes.
We're lost. A crease formed on Morwen's brow as she pored over the map. Berenguer, sitting across from her at a table near the fire, said nothing. The pair had spent the last 2 days holed up at the Forgotten Stop, an out-of-the-way tavern deep in the heart of rural Leinster. Outside, the last vestiges of summer were fading, and soon the leaves would begin to turn. Morwen held the map closer and studied it in the firelight, as if there was something she had missed.
I don't understand. According to the map, we should have reached the Wrenwood by now.
She jabbed a speck on the map with her finger.
We passed the Mount of Guarding not 3 days ago, and turned north at the River Nor just like we were supposed to.
Fwelon, a wolfhound nearly Morwen's size, nudged her head over the young woman's shoulder and sniffed the weathered parchment. As a rule, Fwelon disliked people almost as much as Berenguer did, but in Morwen's case she had made an exception. For her part, Morwen had taken to spoiling Fwelon whenever she thought Berenguer wasn't looking, and in her presence the fierce hound became as docile as a pup. Exasperated, Morwen returned the map to the table and let out a protracted sigh.
Useless.
She cast a glance at a stack of books beside her.
If only there was some enchantment to...
She stopped suddenly and narrowed her gaze in Berenguer's direction.
You're awfully quiet, even for you.
You're the one who said you wanted a life of adventure. You can't adjust to a life on the road until you learn how to properly read a map.
I'm a magician, not a cartographer.
Morwen waved a hand in the air dismissively and patted Fwelon's head.
And don't think I'm letting you off that easy. I can tell you're hiding something.
Berenguer tried to keep the amusement out of his voice. Usually she was the one to tease him. Is that so? He raised his tankard to his lips, gulped down a mouthful of ale, and wiped his unruly red beard with his forearm. They drew a number of glances from the hall's other occupants, and with good reason. Berenguer and Morwen made an unusual pair of travelling companions. Even seated, Berenguer was easily recognizable as the tallest and largest man in the room. Unlike Morwen, who at 16 was in the bloom of youth, he was well into his 40s. Scars marred the right side of his face, and a patch covered his right eye. None would mistake him for anything other than a hardened warrior. In contrast, there was little to hint that Morwen, having discarded the blue robes she'd worn as Munster's court magician in favour of mundane travelling clothes, was about as far from an ordinary girl as one could get and still remain human. Anyone taking a look at the potions and spellbooks inside her satchel would quickly realize there was much more to her under the surface. Morwen ran a hand through bushy brown hair and tucked a loose strand behind her ear.
You don't fool me. I know that look. You're waiting for something, aren't you?
She glanced around the room.
And you're not the only one. Everyone in here seems on edge.
The barmaid approached to refill Berenguer's tankard. Preoccupied by the sight of his scars, she spilled a portion of ale, flushed a deep shade of red, and fled with a frightened yelp. Berenguer, who was accustomed to his appearance having such an effect, drank from the tankard without missing a beat. I don't know what you mean. In truth, he had stayed at the forgotten stop some months back, and the proprietors were no less afraid of him now than they were then.
In case you've forgotten, we're supposed to be looking for the Oak Seer's Grotto so I can craft a new staff.
Her previous magician staff had been destroyed weeks earlier, in a fight against a dark sorceress and a winged serpent. Berengar shrugged. So we are. I knew this tavern was in the area and thought it would be a good place to rest while we searched for your grotto. I spent some time here before receiving King Mor's summons.
Morwen was, in fact, Mor's illegitimate daughter, the product of a union between the king and a particularly nasty witch, though Berengar felt no need to call attention to that fact with prying ears about.
When Mor was murdered, Berengar and Morwen had worked together to identify the king's killer, Morwen's half-sister, the Princess Ravena.
So that was City of Thieves, read by Matt Addis and by our guest Kyle Alexander Romines. A very small part of it. That was a 5-minute segment of the whole book. So it's very nice to have a flashback to what I was reading a week and a half ago, and it's always nice to hear Matt's voice soothingly with his sort of bassy baritone tones coming through that way. I always soothes me. I really enjoy his voice. And I forgot I can't remember I haven't actually mentioned Fuelan at all so far. He's one of my favorite characters in the fact that he's, just the most loyal dog of all time, wolf pup of all time. It's always nice to hear from him again. So Hando says, I approve of this recording. Well done. I think everybody enjoyed listening to that. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Kyle. What was your thoughts listening back to it again? Now that you're thinking way ahead towards the next books, and what's going to be coming next, thinking with anthology. What's it like going back to book 3 again?
Oh, I'm always of two minds, because the first is I love hearing Matt's voice. I love the narration. I hate reading my own writing, so I'm always torn. So the audiobook is an existential crisis for me because I love his voice, and then getting me to read one of my own books is one of the hardest things, and you obviously have to do it in the editing process, but I have I don't know, some people don't like hearing the sound of their own voice. I don't like reading my own writing. And it's tough because I absolutely have to do it, especially with this fantasy series, because I put in so much detail and backstory that with each book, I have to go back and review what came before just to make sure I'm keeping continuity and that I am doing all the characters justice. But yeah, that's my feelings on that.
Well, no, I love that you bring that up, because one of my questions has been, and this audio clip brought it back to mind for me. I love how you treat me as a reader, as a listener to your work, in the sense that you have so many books coming through the same series, and in doing that, so many characters. I love the callbacks that you do, and just even in that scene, the fresh description of Berengar's appearance as a reminder to me as a reader what he is, what he looks like, because I've realized in some reading and some different books I've gone through, when you have a series of books that continue on, for me as a reader, it's really important for those callbacks, because I'm one of these terrible ones who sometimes the names start to kind of muddle for me, but I have this very distinct image of the character, the personality, what their background is. And so if I don't get that callback, it sometimes takes a little bit for me to sometimes realize when a character's come back into the scene, back into the story. But with you, you've done a really good job for me of the first time they're introduced, or right when a scene comes up like this one in the pub where someone else is going to be observing Berengar and Morwen at the same time, you give me that description. You say, oh, by the way, here's that character again. And you did that several times through City of Thieves when you did Back to Godfrey and Back to Others, where it was neat for me to real quick go, oh, that's right, that's who that is from the previous book. All of a sudden, I don't have to think too hard into it as to who it was. It's right there for me. Is that something is just a technique that you've always had? Is it something you're very conscious of? Because you mentioned that you go back and you have to, as much as you dislike rereading your own work, for the continuity and keeping that in check. Is that part of your conscious process in writing?
Wayne, that is such an insightful question. I am so excited that you said that. It is 100% something that I enjoy reintroducing characters and bringing old characters and new characters and shuffling them into the mix. And I have to be, it's a fine line, because I don't want to spend several paragraphs reintroducing Morwen or doing that with all the characters, because then people who have read all the books back to back, or eventually I'm going to collect all the books in one collection. I don't want to have too much reintroduction, but at the same time, like you said, I work hard for these books to all be standalone books. And so I want someone to be able to jump in, not having read Wrath of Lords, and still be able to be introduced to Godfrey, for example, without having to read the first book. But for those people who are loyal and who have invested in each book, to bring it back to, say, the Thunder Rune, for example, things like that, the goblin that Berenger carried away at the end of Wrath of Lords. I do want there to be a reward for people who are invested. And so it's always been this fine line to where it's not, in many fantasy series, you have this epic grand story, and maybe the story of one can't stand on its own because you have to read 2 and 3 to get the complete story. And so it's a little bit tougher to try and design 6 books that all stand alone. And I know I won't be able to do this with the 6th book, and that's fine. But a series of mostly standalone books that yet also tell a larger story. And it's been tough, but I think it's very much worth the reward. I think readers appreciate it. I mentioned this on the last show, but I got tired as a fantasy reader of seeing a book that seemed interesting, and it's book 3 of 14, but to start the series, you have to have read 2 companion series. And, and so my idea is I want every story to stand alone, as even the Tales of Fail that I'm releasing. You don't have to have read the main series to read the Tales of Fail, and you don't have to read the Tales of Fail to understand the main series. But if you do, then there's an extra reward, an extra appreciation. That's my goal anyway.
Well, and
no, you do a very
appreciate
good job with that.
Yeah, and I think just the way you captured that right there in a way that I've tried to understand what it was I appreciated. When you said how much care you're taking into making sure each book can on its own stand alone in a lot of ways, and where that callback or that initial introduction of characters, scenes, or things like that, or cities works so well to achieve that. Because I have read some works where I felt like I was missing something in the reading of it until I went back and caught what was essentially an addendum or an addition, a companion book that wasn't part of the main series or something, and then say, oh, actually, gosh, I kind of wish there had been more throwback to it, because I was lost until I went and read it. And then it added not just more impact, but for me, core elements of the story. And I haven't had that challenge at all with your books. It's right there. It comes through. It's fluid, and it's wonderful.
Thank you. The end of this book gave me some trouble at first, because I do have some threats that are introduced in the book and linger. And so it is, I didn't want it to, I actually had to work on it very carefully towards the end to make sure it wasn't too much of a to be continued. Will this character, will this bad guy return? So I tightened up the end of the story in the editing process to make sure that was less of an idea, so that it would be more self-contained.
No, that's good. And it actually just reminded me again of another one when you were saying threats and stuff. It reminded me of the previous book with, I think it's Imogen, the character, where remembering where the way Berenger was able to talk about some of the motivation why he was suspect of anyone in a ruling or power position because of what had happened in the previous story. And it brought it back to mind, like, that's right. For so much of it, it was all going to be wonderful, and it seems like the right way. And then it ends in such a way that you're kind of like, oh, but not everything is pure. And I appreciated that as well.
Well, and if you read the Tales of Fail, the first couple, it's tough because the books the short stories will spoil some things from the main series. So I actually would recommend people read the main series books first if they have both.
Interesting.
But the first couple stories are Berenger's his origin, some of the things that will be discussed in book 4, and you really learn why he has such hatred or dislike, contempt, mistrust of nobles and royals, because he was not some great hero. He was an ordinary person born in an ordinary small village, and in the north there are huge class distinctions. So he grew up in a very hard life, just trying to survive. He gets constantly drafted into armies to fight the goblins on account of his size, and it's a warrior country. And he just feels that the nobles are sacrificing the regular men and women, and then not even having the decency to bury them in some cases. And then when it's all said and done, he has to go back to his village, and he has severe PTSD and put his life back together. And you see where he has a dislike of that someone like Warden Dara, who we haven't met yet, but he's also introduced in book 5, and he's the captain of the Wardens, fought Azeroth in single combat in the Shadow Wars. He's seen as the greatest hero since Thane Ramsay, and Berenger has this kind of jealousy, this rivalry with him. And you see how someone like Dara, who is this knight who protected a king before the Shadow Wars, he's beloved and fits in well in royal circles and just is adored. And Berenger, Nora is pretty much the only royal he's ever trusted or liked, and she had to earn his trust. And that's the thing about Berenger. He's very mistrustful of people by nature. He's a loner by nature, and yet if you have his trust, if you're one of the few people who he does like, there's not, and I'm sure you know people like this in real life, that they will, if they do like you, they will give you the shirt off their back. They will do anything for you. You see this in City of Thebes when someone wants to hurt Morwen. Berenger is so angry, he just will kill. That's how Berenger is. He's a loner, but if he likes you, you have a friend that will do anything for you.
That's really interesting what you're saying about bringing in PTSD as well as one of the issues that Berenger has to face. I think it's really fascinating that you want to shine a light on mental illness in a fantasy setting. I feel like it's something that's not very, it's almost ignored in a lot of fantasy books. I mean, obviously in fantasy there's a lot of combat, there's a lot of people getting, stabbed, killed, getting magic fireballs to the face, whatever it may be, and they tend to walk away and then get back to life as normal, as if nothing has changed. I think it's really interesting that you want to actually introduce that level of reality where you don't just walk away and everything's fine. You walk away and then you might start shaking. You might have this mental scars. What made you decide to add that into the book?
Well, I was in my medical school. I did many psychiatry rotations. Psychiatry to me is one of the most interesting fields of medicine. So I encountered patients with PTSD. And to me, the idea is, think about Lord of the Rings when Frodo gets stabbed on Weathertop. And then at the end of the series, even after Sauron is defeated, some wounds don't heal. So you have Berenger, and he comes back from fighting the goblins and fighting the goblins and fighting the goblins. And you see in the first short story in the anthology how he tries to return to life in his village. But he's angry. He's haunted by all the people that he couldn't save. And you see him try to control his temper, and yet he has these outbursts. And the process of trying to go back to who he was before is so difficult. And he just wants to be, I can't say anything without spoiling some of the other characters that appear in that short story. But you see him try desperately to return to the life of this simple farmer, this simple villager. And it's so difficult for him. And then in the second story in the anthology, which is another Berenger story, the Price of Hate, he's fallen into the life of this outlaw life. So we also allude in the books to Berenger's past as an outlaw, and we will get into that in a huge deal in book 4 as well when he comes back to the north.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really interesting. So I promised my wife I would get back to her questions that she sent in. So let me just jump on those here as well. So some of these are a little bit these are kind of like generic questions to ask an author. Like I said, she's really interested in writing herself, so I think this comes from her own experiences as well. So the first question she asked was, what genre of literature do you like the least, and why?
Oh gosh, that is a very hard question.
It is, isn't it?
I haven't read that much that I can't say that I can't find something good in. I'm the type of person who, if you really want to pin me down, I remember a few weeks ago, you were talking about Wayne's thoughts on Star Wars, and he said that he had so many thoughts that he couldn't put them just into your conversation. And it made me think, so if you really pin me down on something, I can break it down and say, oh, I didn't like this. I didn't think that this was consistent. I did like this. That approach I could do. But on the surface, I can read or watch and enjoy most things on a superficial level without too much criticism. And then if I start thinking about it, I can definitely break it down more. But so as to answer your wife's question, even if I have very rarely read things that are the books that are garbage. And even when I've read other books in the same genre. It's just very difficult question to ask. Tell your wife she stumped me because I'm serious. there are good books in every genre and bad books. So I've read a really good biography. I would never say that biography is my to-go-to genre, and yet if it's very well written, it just can get my attention. And the same thing I've read very poorly written books in fantasy. And yet I love the genre. So it's, she stumped me. I can't answer the question. Maybe romance, but even then, I'll admit that I've read a couple good romances that my sisters have given me over the years. So she got me. She bested me.
Oh, good question. Thank you very much, dear, for passing that one in, because that was a good one. What's your favorite time period to read or write about? I think this means it's sort of like a non-fiction sense in terms of human history. What's the sort of time period that you enjoy writing most about?
Well, my thrillers are all contemporary, so they're written in the present tense, and those are really fun to write because I don't have to create my own world. I don't have to create my own rules of magic. I don't have to look up the meanings for words and craft spells and
learn Gaelic along the way.
Yeah, I just have to throw a few creepy scarecrows into the mix and everything works out. So I would say just sticking to modern times. I do have a novel, Bride, about the Bride of Frankenstein that's in the Victorian era, and so I had to do more research for that. And so that's probably why I like writing my thrillers in contemporary America, is because it's easier and faster.
That's good. What time of day do you do your best writing? Are you a night owl or a morning bird?
Oh, no mornings for me. I'm night owl all the way because it's quiet, there's no distractions, and if it's dark, I can just slip away and let the characters take over. And I can just be my most productive at night because there are no distractions. There's nobody, especially here during the pandemic when I've been quarantined, there's nobody stomping around upstairs at night. Everybody's asleep. And I think night is the most productive time for me. And I'm a night owl in general. In times when the world is not ending, I like to go outside in the city and walk around at night, just especially in the summertime when it's warm or if I'm traveling. And it's as if the world is different, and my imagination can take flight.
No, I agree with that. I get where you're coming from as well. I'm not much of a night owl, but I do feel like the world is different at night, and I love taking nighttime walks as well. How do you get past your writer's block?
Music. I'm very fortunate that I very rarely have writer's block. Very rarely. And if I ever do, I take a walk and listen to music, which music is just like a muse for my imagination. Or I start writing something different. So I've had a couple books where I've gotten stuck, and then I've written either a short story or a completely different book, and then come back to it and I picked it back up. And the act of writing something, even if it's something different, gets those wheels turning in your head, and then that's always has done the trick for me.
And her last question is, do you writing characters of your own gender or of different genders?
All right, I would like you to guess. I would like you to guess based on the Warden books.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there's probably just as many female as male characters in the Warden books. Of course, the main character is male, which would imply that it's easier, I suppose. But the leader of the land is female. One of the main companions is female, being a magician. I don't know, actually. I'm going to go with male just because of the main character, I think. How about that?
So I would say I enjoy writing female characters more. So if you look, Morwen, Ravana, Azura, Nora, the list goes on. I don't know why. People have asked me this before. I actually had someone call me once and say, "Oh, I read your novel Bride. I loved it so much. How did you put yourself?" Because that's a first person. How did you put yourself in the female? Like, why do you like to write these characters so much? And I don't really have an answer, but I really enjoy it. And it's fun surrounding Berenger, taking this male character and putting him around all these different females in a non-romantic role. Yeah, he has some romantic tension with Ravana, but he admires and platonically loves Nora. He has a paternal type love for Morwen. He has a sense of respect / consternation toward Azura. And it's just fun to write male-female relationships and dynamics that are not always defined in terms of romance. And it's also fun to give female characters non-traditional roles, and yet still having female characters that do have traditional roles, and just mixing it up in a way to show that people are different. And it's fun to show that you can't just hamstring people into one role or another.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think even Berenger himself is quite, in many ways, is a very traditional male character in the sense that he's gruff and he's rough and he deals with things with his axe. But at the same time, you do see him sort of expressing emotion when the time does come across to those that he cares about. And I think that shows a level of growth in him as well. And I think the best way to sort of break these traditional boundaries of male-female stereotypes is to have them in your world and then somewhat break them, And I think that's what you do.
You see King Moore, for example, in book 2, they're all having dinner and he says something, Ravana says something, and he says, "My daughter needs to learn to mind her own tongue."
Yes.
And then so you see that there are, in the context of the stories, these traditional roles that are being imposed, and yet many of the characters refuse to obey them or or in their own way, defy stereotypes in their own ways. And I would say really quickly too, if your wife has any more questions about writing, whether it's editing, publishing, cover art, anything like that, please pass them along. Feel free to email me or anything. I'm happy to talk. I've mentored a lot of writers, or even there was one lady that I went out for lunch with, and she said, I'm a Vietnam War survivor. I immigrated to the United States. I want to write my memoirs. What should I do? I've had young people say, I have written a short story, things like that. So any way that I can be helpful to you and your wife, just let me know.
Well, that's very kind, Cal. Thank you so much. Well, for anybody out there, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who wants to start writing, or whether they're like working full time or whether they're a student, and they might not have enough time to actually do the writing, or they're struggling to find their passion or anything like that? But what kind of advice would you give to a early career author?
Sure. Well, if you want to write books, you have traditional publishing and you have self-publishing, and I've done both. So the first thing you need to focus on is writing the book. And once you get the book written, then if you traditionally publish, you send in query letters to agents or to publishers themselves. And there are some resources out there like the Writer's Market, which is a great book. It has a list of all the book publishers in the United States, Canada, and Australia. And it breaks it down by, do they want nonfiction or fiction? And if they're looking for fiction, what type of fiction do they want, and then what are the ways to contact them, and do they want a chapter, do they want a whole book, do they just want a letter? So that's traditional publishing, and then you just submit until you hear back. And then self-publishing is the things that a publisher does, so cover art, editing, proofreading, formatting. That's up to you. So you take on all those roles, and I've done both. And you get that freedom in return. So you can set your own prices, you can edit your own books, or pay people to do it. And they both have pros and cons, and they're both good things to do for each of them. So if you're somebody who's out there and you're interested in writing a book, like I said, feel free to send me an email, and at whatever stage of the process you're in. I have a Facebook friend right now who is she was emailing me or messaging me a couple weeks ago about she's written a children's book, and how does she find illustrators? So I reached out to my sister, who's actually worked with an illustrator before, to try and get some resources for her. So whatever stage of the process you're in, whether you're at the stage where, oh, I have a book that's done and I need an editor or I need a cover, or you're just starting out trying to write and figure out, how do I write a book? Feel free to reach out. It's so rewarding. It is deeply rewarding. It's very vulnerable because you're putting parts of yourself into your work always, and it's out there for the world to see and to judge. But at the same time, you're expressing yourself and your feelings and your voice. And I love writing. It's something that I'm immensely passionate about, and so I encourage your wife to keep with it. And I'm very excited to see what happens.
As am I. She's a fantastic writer, and I look forward to seeing what she produces in the future as well. So we're reaching towards the last 10 minutes of the show, so I think we should probably start wrapping up with any general questions for you, Kyle. Is there anything you want to give a shout out to? Anything you want to? I know we've done a couple of announcements today. Is there anything else you want to point people to, resources-wise, online or anything like that?
Sure. So I have 11 books out now. And then my 12th book will be The Tales of Fail, which should be out next month. Kyle Alexander Romines on Amazon. I also have 8 short stories now. These are the individual tales of fail. The latest one, The End of Legends, which is set after the events of the main series, I published yesterday/today. So this is also the first time I'm revealing that story is out. So if you're listening or watching the show, you can head on over to Amazon. You're the first. You could be the first reader. I have also. I have made every single story in that collection 99 cents for today. So if you are, some of the stories were 99 cents, some were $2.99. But if you are out there watching the show, all 8 stories are now 99 cents. So special deal for my Show X friends out there.
That's fantastic. So we've given a link to everybody in the chat there, so go check it out. That is really exciting. I think I'll have to go pick up a couple of those as well. 99 cents is a great deal for some great writing, so go check that out on Kyle's page there. If you are interested in the future and you want to see what else he's up to, be sure to hit follow as well, and that way you can see what's going on there as well. You've also got Instagram and such. Do you want to give a shout out to those?
Sure. I actually don't remember what my Instagram is.
It's the Kyle Alexander, one word.
I've mainly used that in the past for friends and stuff, but I've started putting more book stuff on there lately.
Cool.
Instagram's fun, and I'm just now getting back into it after a while.
I really enjoy it. Yeah, I really like Instagram. There's something basic human psyche that you get a bit of a dopamine kick from getting those likes, I think. So I always enjoy it for that. Okay, that's really exciting for you. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us today, Kyle. It's been really exciting having you on. Thank you for answering all the questions I had that largely come from the fact that I'm enjoying your series and just trying to weasel out some interesting facts about the universe, as well as your writing style and all the advice you gave to all potential writers out there as well. Much, much appreciated. So I think with that, we'll wrap up the show, if that's all right, Mr. Wayne. So thank you again for being here, Kyle. And you're welcome back again. If you have any future announcements you want to make, or if you just want to come hang out, you're more than welcome to. And again, if you're ever in the area of Michigan, or I'm sure Wayne will say the same for Colorado. Be sure to give us a shout, and we'll do what we can to meet up and buy you a coffee or something, you know.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. You've been listening to Show X on twitch.tv/VTW Show X. You can find us all over the web. You can find us on twitter.com/VTW Show X, twitter.com/DocDead, twitter.com/DrKenRead for the show, for Mr. Wade and for myself. You can find us on Instagram as well. If you search for Show X there, you'll find us no problem. You can also find Kyle there under the Kyle Alexander on Instagram. Be sure to check out Kyle's link to Amazon that's there in the chat as well, and we'll be sure to have it on available elsewhere in the show notes and such too. You can also check us out on Facebook, search for ShowX there. You can email us to vtwshowx@gmail.com if you want to ask us any questions, if you want to get any links or anything we've mentioned, we can help you out there. And tell us your geek cred, and we'll be sure to discuss it next week as well. And also, if you have any suggestions for people we should interview in the future, you can email us as well or send us a tweet, and we will certainly try our best to get them on too. You can also support us on patreon.com/showx for a minimum of $1 per month, and that helps us just stay afloat and keep our software subscriptions up to date, keep our hardware up to date, and all that good stuff too. You can also check us out on reddit.com/r/showx and take part in the post-show discussion there. There's a comment section for every single show link, so be sure to jump in there and chat there if you have anything you want to say. I think that's everything. We have too many social media links. We need to get one of those link trees for the show, I think. That'll make it much easier. Check out everything there, and then we don't have to talk too much about it. So again, thank you so much, Kyle, for being on the show. Thank you, Mr. Wayne, for hosting. And thank you, the listener, for listening in as well. And we'll see you all next week.
All right, everybody. Thank you.